Alright, in this video I'm going to cover Thomas Aquinas' metaphysical arguments for the existence of God. So in the Summa Theologica, Aquinas introduces the so-called 5 ways of proving God's existence. These arguments have in common a philosophical strategy. They all appeal to some aspect of reality and note that aspect of reality and show that that aspect of reality provides evidence for the need for something like God, something as powerful as God. So they suggest, given how things are, God's existence seems necessary. So we'll focus here on the second way because I think it's generally representative of the overall philosophical strategy. In the second argument, he's going to appeal to the basic law of cause and effect. So, in the law of cause and effect, all observable events are brought about by preceding causes, and so it follows that nothing happens on its own or by miracle. In the second way, Aquinas is going to posit that the law of cause and effect will itself need a cause. In other words, the causal chain needs to be brought about by something. And the thing which brings about the causal chain will need to be able to cause itself, since it's not part of the causal chain. In other words, Aquinas thinks it's necessary to assume something which causes itself, and then once it does so, it causes the entire causal chain, captured by the law of cause and effect, of natural and then human history. Here's the argument. Premise 1, we observe the regular order of cause and effect. This is just a statement of the law of cause and effect, and it says that every event occurs as a result of previous events. Nothing happens by itself. Everything that happens is brought about by something which precedes it. 2 says that since nothing can exist prior to itself, nothing can cause itself. So the second premise contains some basic logical or maybe metaphysical ideas. We can't exist prior to ourselves, and no thing can exist prior to itself. That's conceptually impossible, just based on what existence means. And nothing can cause itself, because in order to cause something, you have to exist before it. So to cause yourself, you would have to exist before yourself. But you can't exist before yourself or prior to yourself, so you can't cause yourself. If a previous cause does not exist, neither does the thing that results. This is just stating a basic implication of the law of cause and effect. Without causes, there won't be effects. Without the thing that brings about the event cannot occur. Premise 4, therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. So premise 4 really inflates the importance of premise 3. It notes that events in the causal chain are causally related to each other and then to the beginning of the causal chain. That's why it's a chain. Events at the beginning of the chain cause events in the middle of the chain, and events in the middle of the chain cause the events that are here and now. And it follows that if the beginning of the causal chain did not occur, the rest of the events in the causal chain would not occur. Premise 5. If a series of causes and effects extends infinitely backwards, there would be no things existing now, because there is no first cause in an infinite causal chain. Right, so this is going to build on the idea that there must be a first cause in the causal chain. But if the causal chain is infinite, there is no first cause. And if there's no first cause, then there wouldn't be things now, because the causal chain requires a first cause in order to bring about the things that exist now. Premise 6. Purely empirical observation. There are things existing now. Just look around. This is also a negation of the second clause of premise 5, which says there would be no things existing now. So I think what Aquinas is saying here is that that since there are things existing now, the causal chain cannot extend infinitely backwards. Because if the causal chain extended infinitely backwards, there would be no first cause, and so there couldn't be things now. Since there are things now, this shows us that the causal chain had a beginning. It's not infinite. Premise 7. Therefore, the causal chain does not extend infinitely backwards. So this is just going to express the implication of 5 and 6 taken together. Since things are currently existing, and since things couldn't exist if the causal chain extended infinitely backwards, it follows that the causal chain cannot extend infinitely backwards. So the only way for there to be things now is that the causal chain is not infinite. Premise 8. We must therefore posit a first cause, a so-called first mover, which causes both itself and the causal chain. So since the causal chain cannot be infinite, since it's finite, we have to posit something which brought it about. And the thing which brought it about could not be brought about by the causal chain. It has to precede the causal chain. So this is something that exists prior to the causal chain, something which comes into existence of its own accord. And once it comes into its own existence of its own accord, it then brings about the causal chain. So premise 8 is just saying that if the causal chain is finite, which it seems it has to be on Aquinas' logic, then something must produce the start of the causal chain. But since this thing starts the causal chain can't cause it. So the thing needs to precede the causal chain, and the only way for it to do that is for it to be able to cause itself. It has to be a first mover. Premise 9. God is an all-powerful being, and thus can cause itself. So premise 9 is really just assuming a specific conception of God, and then it's additionally supposing that when we say that something's all-powerful, we include in as one of those powers the ability to cause oneself. So an all-powerful thing would have the ability to cause itself. You might object to this premise just by saying even all-powerful things need to be brought about by something else. And then 10, therefore God exists. That is the conclusion. So the conclusion rests on the idea that since things are currently existing now, and since an infinite causal chain is conceptually impossible, there must be a first mover which can cause itself. And only an all-powerful being like God could be such a first mover. All right, so here's the argument taken together. So I'm just going to read through this one more time. You might pause here and read through this a few times, just looking at the overall logic. Premise 1 says, we observe the regular order of cause and effect. Everything that happens as a result of things which precede them. Premise 2, since nothing can exist prior to itself, nothing can cause itself. Everything is brought about by things which precede them. This must be the case since we can't cause ourselves. Premise 3, if a previous cause does not exist, neither does the thing that results. 4, therefore if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in a series exists. Premise 5, if a series of causes extends infinitely backwards, there would be no things existing now, because there's no first cause in an infinite causal chain. 6. But after all, there are things now. Just look around. 7. Therefore, the causal chain does not extend infinitely backwards. Because if it extended infinitely backwards, there'd be no first cause. And if there would be no first cause, then there'd be no current events. And there are current events, so it follows that the causal chain does not extend infinitely backwards. It has a beginning. So 8, we must therefore posit a first cause, a so-called first mover which causes itself and the causal chain. This is something which brings about the entire chain of events of all of natural history, and which brings about itself before it does so. God is all-powerful, and thus can cause itself. Premise 9, this is just a statement of an idea of God. And then 10, therefore God exists. All right. Finally, we're going to look at Bertrand Russell's objection to the argument. So Russell's going to object to this argument by arguing that it suffers from a logical fallacy. And you can think of a logical fallacy as a problem with the structure of the argument that makes it invalid. Remember, validity is about the structure and the success of the structure of the argument. All right, so the logical fallacy that Russell identifies is called the fallacy of composition. And the fallacy of composition occurs when an argument assumes that whatever attributes are possessed by parts of the thing will also be possessed by the whole of a thing. So if the parts of a thing have a specific attribute, the entire thing will have that attribute. So here's an example. Since each part of the car is lightweight, the car itself is lightweight. So each of the individual parts has a specific attribute, being light. Thus it follows that the car is itself lightweight. You can see how this is a fallacy because even if you made a car out of relatively lightweight pieces, those lightweight pieces might add up to an especially heavy thing. So that's the fallacy of composition. Russell thinks that Aquinas assumes that since each event in the causal chain has the property of being caused, then it follows that the entire causal chain must have the property of being caused. So, although the law of cause and effect is right to say that each event in the causal chain is going to have a cause, the causal chain itself as the whole doesn't necessarily have that same property of being caused. And this is because the whole, i.e. the causal chain, needn't possess all of the attributes possessed by the parts, i.e. the individual events. So just as the car needn't be lightweight just because the individual parts of the car are lightweight, so too, just because the individual events in the causal chain have the property or attribute of being caused, it's not necessarily the case that the whole causal chain has that same property. And if the entire causal chain doesn't need to have the property of being caused, then we are able to posit that the causal chain can be infinite. It can go backwards infinitely, and we don't need to worry about there being a first cause. And if we don't need to worry about there being a first cause, then we don't need to do the work of trying to show that there is an all-powerful being that can cause itself and then cause the causal chain. All right. In review, Aquinas offers a deductive argument for the existence of God. This is an argument which tries to show that God necessarily exists, just given how things are. He argues that the causal chain cannot be infinite, and so we must suppose the existence of a first mover, a thing which causes itself and then the causal chain. Aquinas thinks this first mover is God because God is all-powerful. But Russell objects to this argument by noting that even though if it's true that every event has a cause, it doesn't follow that the causal chain itself needs a cause. If the causal chain doesn't itself need a cause, then we don't need to worry about there being a first cause. The causal chain can be infinite. And if the causal chain can be infinite, and we don't need to worry about a first cause, then we don't need to posit an all-powerful being like God, which causes itself, and then causes the causal chain.